Afternoon. How are you, Secretary? Right here?
Yep.
All right. Okay.
Got a report for you to sign here.
All right. It's one of these pens.
That'd be great.
How you doing, buddy? Ready? Okay, there you go. That's signed.
Glad to see you all. Good afternoon and welcome to the Prospective Plantings and Grain Stocks Briefing. My name is Joe Parsons. I serve as Chair of the Agricultural Statistics Board here at NASS. This briefing is for the Secretary and other policymakers at USDA to better understand the content and context of today's reports. We're thrilled to have Secretary Bill Sack and Dr. Seth Meyer, USDA's Chief Economist, join us today for the first public live stream of a Prospective Plantings briefing. We're excited to open a new avenue to share information from our key reports with data users. Mr. Secretary, I'd like to share that additional staff from our regional field office and other headquarter units helped on this report. John Stevens, Scott Dilworth, Renee Cochran, and Shirley Sampson were of great assistance. I also wanted to take a moment to thank the tens of thousands of farmers that took time out of their busy schedules to answer questions about their farms so that these important data informing the U.S. food and agricultural situation are possible. I have a few notes for our live streaming audience. The March Prospective Plantings and Grain Stocks reports are considered principal federal economic indicator reports. The Office of Management and Budget provides specific guidance on how these important reports are to be released. OMB statistical policy instructs policymaking officials to refrain from making public comment regarding the content of the report within 1 hour of the release of these reports. Federal statistical agencies are guided to provide for a wide distribution of information in a variety of formats and be open about our processes and procedures. We will not be taking questions during this briefing from the public. However, NASS staff are available for email or phone questions, and NASS will host a social media event 1 hour after the release of these data. We strive to have everything presented at this briefing match the official record. However, should there be any discrepancy between what is presented at this briefing and the published estimates, always refer to the official published estimates. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Lance Hodig, Chief of the NASS Crops Branch. Lance?
All right, thank you, Joe. Good afternoon, Mr. Secretary. Welcome. Appreciate you joining us today. I've got a lot of information to share with you today. So I'm really just going to jump right in here. Obviously, as Joe mentioned, we'll have an opportunity to field any questions that you might have at the end of the presentation. So before I get into the numbers themselves, though, I always like to give you just a quick snapshot of the survey work that we did feeding into these estimates. As you can see on this first slide, basically two survey efforts that we utilized to collect this information. The first we call our March Ag Survey. This is a survey of farmers. You can see nearly 73,000 farmers were sampled between February 26th and March the 19th. We asked them to report how many acres of the various crops do you intend to plant this season. And in addition to that, that's also where we collect the on-farm portion for the grain stocks report. So we also asked them to report their quantities of grains and oilseeds stored as of March the 1st. The second survey effort, as you can see, is our off-farm grain stock survey. There's about 8,200 of these commercial facilities across the country. And so we're gathering, of course, from them the quantities of grains and oilseeds that they have stored as of March the 1st. And at the bottom half of the screen there, you can see a map just showing you kind of how those samples were distributed for the farmer survey across the country. I always like to remind everyone that March is intentions. It is estimates of planted acreage based on farmers' reported intentions. Essentially, that's what we like to remind folks with this graphic. As you can see on the left, that gold-colored bar, that's the survey period. If you look at the gray and the black lines, you can see that's the average planting progress for corn and soybeans in the U.S. So obviously, we're collecting this intention information before farmers, in most cases, are in the fields planting. And so there are some changes that can occur as we move through the rest of the season. Before we talk individual crops, let me give you a big picture look at what's happening this season. We'll start things off by looking at the principal crop planted acreage. Of course, the principal crops is simply a sum of the 22 major crops grown across the U.S. The blue box at the bottom shows you what each of those 22 crops are. But as you can see, we're expecting 317.4 million acres to be planted this season to these 22 major crops. That's up just 0.1% or 214,000 acres from what was actually planted to these same crops last season. You can see the top 5 states listed both at the bottom and in the pie chart to the right. Just to put a little bit more perspective around that, this next chart shows that same 317.4 million acre planted estimate, but a little bit more history to track back to there. And of course, we already talked about the fact that it's very similar to last year. You can also see on this graphic, pretty comparable to what we saw before the big dip back in 2019. Of course, we all know that was largely driven by prevent plant issues that season. About 2 million acres below where we were back in 2018. The next slide that I have for you puts a little bit more perspective around that comparison back to those earlier years. Here you see an extra line on the graphic as the lighter colored line you see that says planted adjusted. Back in beginning with that 2019 crop year, we made some program adjustments here at NASS. And so if you put everything on the same playing field here, you can see that's what that orange line represents. So with the same program definition, back in 2018, for example, it would have actually been 318.3 million acres. So about 1 million of those acre difference you see is simply programmatic. And so very much in line with what we've seen in recent years is the point there. The first map, data map that I have for you today shows the principal crop planted acreage by state with a comparison to the previous year. The way this map is laid out, the top number is that principal crop planted acreage total. The lower number is the percent change from last year's final plantings. And of course, all the states that are colored in any shade of blue are increasing, any shade of red is decreasing. The deeper the color, the larger the change. And you can see there are increases and decreases across the country. But overall, as I mentioned earlier, they all balance out pretty close nationally to what we published last year. This next graphic just gives you a little bit of perspective of what typically happens between March and the end of the season with the final planted acreage numbers. And so as we look at this principal crop total, as you can see, generally speaking, it doesn't move too much other than when we have weather or other issues that cause planting problems. You can see those large drops that have happened in certain years, typically, as I mentioned, related to some kind of problem, keeping farmers from being able to plant what they had intended to. Otherwise, we simply don't see a lot of big, or haven't seen a lot of big changes to this total between these March intentions and the final estimates at the end of the season. So with that said, let's go ahead and start running through the individual crops. We'll start things off with corn. Based on the farmer reported intentions, we are estimating 89.5 million acres to be planted to corn this season. That is down 4.1% or 3.87 million acres from what was planted to corn last year. You can see we're expecting decreases in the top 4 states, Iowa, Illinois, Nebraska, and Minnesota. In fact, if we look at this over time, again, you can see the sharp decline from what we saw planted last year. In fact, this is the largest decline since back in 2014 when we dropped 4.77 million acres from the previous season. Taking a quick look at the corn planted acreage estimates state by state. This map is laid out just like the one I showed you for principal crops. So again, the number of acres planted of corn on the top, the percent change from last year on the bottom, same color scheme, of course, with corn. With the 4.1% decline nationally, you can see we're expecting declines across most of the country. In fact, the largest declines are in Minnesota and North Dakota. That's actually a 600,000 acre decline in Minnesota, 500,000 acre decline in North Dakota. And as you note, there's a couple of symbols on this map that you'll see throughout the presentation. Anytime you see a pound sign, that indicates a record high. And in fact, we do expect record high corn acreage in Nevada and South Dakota this year. And anytime you see the ampersand, that indicates a record low. And in this case, that would be Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, though they are perennial at the level that we're seeing this year. This next graphic just highlights some information based on published industry members' expectations. So what we see here is each one of those blue dots indicates an individual industry member's published expectation of what the corn acreage would be. this season. The red block is that NASS estimate that I just referenced, 89.5 million acres. And so as you can clearly see on this graphic, most folks were expecting a bit more corn acreage this year than what farmers reported to us as intended to do this year. Next, let's shift gears and look at soybeans. Based on, again, the survey work that we did, we're expecting 91 million acres of soybeans to be planted this year. That's up 4.3% or 3.76 million acres from what was planted last year. And so you can just see where the acres mostly went that we took out of corn. We just shifted them over to soybeans here. A lot of switching happening there, of course, based on some of the high nitrogen prices, pushing to more farmers toward soybeans than corn. I would point out that this would represent the third time in history that we have planted more soybeans than corn in the U.S. should these intentions be realized. And again, just to put a little perspective around it here, you can see I didn't mention on the previous slide, but the 91 million acres does represent a new record high soybean planted acreage here in the U.S. Taking a quick look at those soybean acreage numbers by state and how they compare with last year, obviously just the opposite of what we saw with corn. Instead of mostly red colored states, you see mostly blue. Increases across most of the growing area. Here you see a lot of pound signs, a lot of record high acreage is expected this year. Illinois, Kentucky, Michigan, Missouri, Nebraska, Ohio, South Dakota, and Wisconsin, all intending to plant record high soybean acreage this season. And taking a quick look at the published industry expectations for soybean planted area and how they compare with today's published estimate. Here you can see just the opposite situation, as most folks were expecting fewer acres of soybeans this year than what we are estimating. This next map just takes the corn and soybean acres and puts them together and just shows you what's happening with those two crops combined compared with last year. You can see overall the 180.4 million acres is down just 0.1% or 107,000 acres from what was planted to these same two crops combined last year, and most of the changes across the country are not terribly big on a state-by-state basis. And if you look at those published industry expectations and combine the corn and soybean numbers together, you can see we're pretty much in line with what folks were expecting. So I think it's just an issue of, how many acres went to each of the two crops, but everyone seems to be in line with what's happening combined. Next, we'll move on to cotton. All cotton acres expected to total 12.2 million acres this season. That's up 9% or just over 1 million acres from what was planted last season. If we take a look at that over time, you can see, again, with of course, the prices currently remaining strong for cotton, some pretty big increases expected there. Looking at it on a state-by-state basis, you can see we're expecting planted area to be up from last year in all states except Arizona. Of course, they're a relatively small acreage state. Texas, of course, our largest producing state. You can see expectations there are up 455,000 acres from what they actually planted last season. Taking a look at the published industry expectations for cotton and how they compare with today's published estimate, you can see maybe just a little bit higher than what most folks were expecting, but we don't have nearly as many folks reporting their expectations for cotton as we did for corn and soybeans. Moving on to winter wheat, of course, this is our second estimate of the season for winter wheat seedings for this current crop season. You can see we're now estimating 34.2 million acres planted this year. That's down just 0.5%. Or 161,000 acres from what we estimated back in January. However, it is still up 1.7% or 588,000 acres from what was planted last season. We're looking at about 23.7 million acres of hard red winter wheat, about 6.9 million acres of soft red, and about 3.6 million acres of white wheat this season. Again, looking at the winter wheat acreage over time, you can see we're actually looking at the second consecutive year of increasing acres after 7 consecutive seasons of decline. Taking a quick look at the winter wheat planted acres by state and how they compare with last year, you can see increases expected across most of the major growing states. The largest increase we see year over year is in Missouri, up 160,000 acres. The largest decrease in Michigan, down 140,000 acres. And as we look at the published expectations for the winter wheat acres, not a big surprise here. You can see falling pretty much in the middle of those published expectations. Next, we'll take a look at other spring wheat. 11.2 million acres expected to be planted this year. That's down 1.9% or 220,000 acres from what was actually planted last year. Hard red spring in particular, 10.5 million acres expected to be planted this season. As we look at that over time, here you can see, again, the fourth consecutive year of declining acreage expected for the other spring wheat this season. Looking at it on a state-by-state basis, a mix of increases and decreases. Of course, North Dakota is our largest producing state. They're expecting spring wheat or other spring wheat to be down 5.5% as they shift more acres to other crops. A lot of different crops we can grow up in that part of the country. And so as a result, you can see what's happening with the spring wheat. Not a huge surprise here either as we look at the published expectations for other spring wheat, maybe just a little bit lower than a lot of folks were expecting, but certainly within the range of expectations. Next, we'll take a look at the durum wheat. 1.92 million acres expected to be planted this year. That's up 17% year over year, 280,000 acres more than was planted last season. You can see graphically how that compares as we actually have a pretty sharp increase there, trying to get back closer to levels of several seasons ago. And as we look at that on a state-by-state basis, of course, North Dakota and Montana make up the vast majority of the durum planted acreage, and you can see we're looking at fairly sharp increases this year in both of those states. Comparing with the published expectations, maybe a little bit higher than folks were expecting on the durum wheat acres today as well. Very quickly, I'll just run through some of the remaining crops in the prospective plantings report. Barley, you can see at 2.94 million acres, expected to be up 10.6% year over year. Canola acres up just 0.3% from what was planted last year. Chickpeas, on the other hand, down 17.6% year over year. Dry edible beans off 5.8% to just over 1.3 million acres this season, and the dry edible peas at 1.1 million acres, up 11.4% from what was actually planted last year. Moving on, flaxseed up 10.8% year over year. Producers expecting to harvest just 50.3 million acres of all hay this season. That's down 0.8% from what they actually harvested last year. Have realized that would be the lowest hay harvested area since 1907. Lentils, you can see expectations there actually up 11.3% year over year to 788,000 acres. Oats off just 0.1% from what was planted last year, and peanut acreage expected to be down 0.9% to 1.57 million acres planted this season. Next, we'll take a look at rice. 2.45 million acres is what producers expect to plant this season. That's down 3.2% from what they actually planted last season. Big drop in sorghum. You can see at 6.2 million acres, down 15.1%. Of course, last year we saw a huge increase in sorghum acres, and that's coming back off this season in favor of other crops. Sugar beets at 1.14 million acres. That's down 1.4% from what was actually planted last season. Sunflowers up nearly 10% from what was planted last season, and tobacco producers expecting to harvest 226,000 acres this year. That's up again 3.4% from what was harvested last season after many years of decline. That represents the second consecutive year of increasing tobacco acreage. So just to kind of sum that up, we hit a lot of different crops throughout the briefing up to this point. So this first chart of a series of combined principal crop charts I want to show you just takes all of those crops and sorts them from largest to smallest, so you can just get some quick perspective around where the largest acreages are this year. And you can see, as I mentioned earlier, soybeans at the top of this graph for the third time in history, corn just shortly behind. Next, we'll take a look at those same crops and just sort them in terms of percent change from last year. So on a percentage basis, you can see that durum wheat showing the largest increase, chickpeas showing the largest decrease. But if we go to the next slide and just put it in terms of acreage, here you can clearly see that the increases, largest increase by far occurring in soybeans, the 3.76 million acre increase. But on the flip side, you can see the corn, as we talked about earlier, also down close to 4 million acres from what was planted. So With that said, we'll shift gears and take a look at the grain stocks report. We'll start things off by talking about all wheat stocks. Of course, this is our third quarter stocks for wheat. You can see as of March the 1st, 1.02 billion bushels stored. That's down 21.8% from what was stored at the same time a year earlier. The on-farm stocks down 38.6%, off-farm down 17.2% year over year. In fact, looking at March 1 stocks historically, that would be the lowest March 1 level since 2008. Next, we'll take a closer look at the all wheat stocks over time. The way this graphic is laid out, each of those vertical bars represents the beginning supply for each crop season. You can see the four horizontal lines representing the 4 quarterly stocks estimates that we publish here at NASS. Of course, as I mentioned, this is third quarter for wheat. So the 1.02 billion bushel total represented by the gray line. Beginning supply, the 2.49 billion bushels was down 12.8% year over year, hence the lower stocks this year compared to last. Looking at our December to February disappearance, 353 million bushels. That was 9.8% below the same time period a year earlier. As we take a look at the published expectations for the all wheat stocks, you can see this shouldn't be a big surprise today either. It's all right at the expectations. Next, we'll take a look at corn stocks. So corn stored as of March the 1st, totaling 7.85 billion bushels. That's up 2.2% from the same time a year earlier. On-farm stocks up 1.1%, off-farm up 3% from what was stored a year earlier. And again, as we take a closer look at the corn stocks over time, the 16.3 billion bushel beginning supply was up 2% from the previous season, and our disappearance from December to Feb for corn, 3.79 billion bushels. That was up 5.4% from the same time period a year earlier. Looking at the corn stocks estimate, how it compares with published expectations, once again, falling right in the middle of the dots there, so should not be a big surprise on the corn stocks estimate today either. Soybean stocks are next, 1.93 billion bushels stored as of March the 1st. That is up 23.7% from March 1 a year earlier. The on-farm stocks up 26.3%, off-farm stocks up 22.1% year over year. That is the fourth highest March 1 stocks for soybeans. Only 2019, 20, and 2018 were the 1, 2, and 3 largest years for the soybean stocks. Taking a look at that over time here, you can see the 4.69 billion bushel beginning supply was down just 1% from the previous season. In fact, it's still the fourth highest beginning supply for soybeans this year. Disappearance from December to Feb, 1.22 billion bushels. That's down 11.9% from the previous year. As we look at the published expectations for soybeans, one of these dots doesn't really look like the others. But if you take that out of the mix, you can see the estimate appears to be clustered pretty closely to most of the expectations for soybean stocks today. Also, we have the rice stocks report today as well. Included in there, you can see the March 1 rough rice stocks total 91.1 million hundredweight. That's down 7.7% from last year. On-farm stocks down 23%, off-farm down just 3.6%. Year over year. And as we take a closer look at the rice stocks, you can see 229 million hundredweight was our beginning supply, off from the previous year. Disappearance for rice this quarter, 138.4 million hundredweight compared to 153.2 a year earlier. Just a few more crops included in the grain stocks report today that I'll highlight. Barley stocks, you can see as of March the 1st, down 39.7% year over year. Durum wheat stocks off 29.6%. From the previous season. Oats off 16.5% from what was stored a year earlier. Sorghum stocks, 207 million bushels there. You can see that's up 51.3% year over year, but as I mentioned earlier on, last year's sorghum crop through the roof because of the increased acreage. So as a result, big stocks this year and probably leading to some of the lower expectations on acreage this year. And then last but not least, our sunflower stocks as of March the 1st, you can see 15.9% below what was stored the same time a year earlier. As we wrap things up here, just a few more highlights for you. This next slide just shows some of the upcoming reports over the next month or so. some of the usual reports in there, although I would mention this coming Monday will be our first crop progress and condition report for the season. That's always a highly watched and highly anticipated throughout the year. Also, excuse me, I want to mention the biannual USDA data users meeting coming up on April 19th in Chicago. We will have in-person and virtual options available, so there's a link there. Folks can go out and get signed up there. Also, it's a census year. 22 Census of Agriculture is ramping up, and so we've got some options for folks to get out here and make sure that we've got you on the list, get you signed up, and you'll be receiving forms later this year. So we're certainly encouraging producers to get those filled out and back to us in a timely fashion. And then last but not least, as Joe mentioned at the opening, I'll be hosting, I call it a monthly Twitter session. We call it Stat Chat. Basically, I'll just be on Twitter fielding any questions that folks might have about today's reports and sharing as much information there as we can as well. So that's the last slide that I have for you today. And I think it's to wrap up the live stream here. We'll go ahead and bring that to a close and thank everybody for joining us. Opportunity to take some questions. So, very much.